Hey everybody, this is Josh, Canadian immigration lawyer and CEO at Visto.ai for another episode of the Canadian Immigration Pros podcast. I am very happy to be joined by Zeynab Ziaie Moayyed. Zeynab, I hope I did that well enough.
You
Thank
did
you.
it very well.
Awesome.
Thank you. That was very well done.
Hey,
Pleasure to be here.
the hard job for me is done. Now I can relax. I'm very happy to have you on the show. Before we jump into some of the very important topics, especially as you were mentioning before the show, crazy times in Canadian immigration. So lots to discuss. Before we jump in, can you give a quick introduction, a little bit more about yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm an immigration lawyer. I'm based in Toronto, and I've been doing immigration pretty much exclusively for over a decade now. And I've had the opportunity to see a lot of the iterations that happen and the ups and downs in terms of policy and approaches to especially business immigration, because I've been doing that since I got started. And I'm very much looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. And I do like to usually set a theme kind of earlier on in the podcast so our listeners or viewers kind of know what we have in store. As you mentioned, there's been so much change. I'll quickly date this recording. It is October 17th that we're recording, October 17th, 2024. The episode will probably be out about a week later. But in case people are listening in the future, the year of 2024 has been crazy. It seems like it will continue to be, and we're heading into an election year as well. So we might
Mhm.
even be just warming up. More specifically, we'll be focusing a little bit more on the corporate and entrepreneurial side, more specifically related to startup visas, tech companies, previous federal programs that I'm really interested to hear about as well, just to kind of set the stage for our listeners and our viewers. The first thing I wanted to touch on, if we're talking about entrepreneurs, you had mentioned to me before the show that there used to be a series of federal business class programs. Now, I only started practicing in 2017. I don't recall if did they even exist then, and or maybe a great way to jump off for this episode is to give
Mhm.
us a little bit of a history on, what did those federal entrepreneurial programs look like and what came of them as well.
Absolutely. So we did at the federal level have specific both entrepreneur programs and investor program. And, this goes back to starting in the 19th, but I can't speak to that part of it, but I can speak to the programs that were in place from 2000 onwards. And, we're talking about a context of there was more variety in the types of program, but overall volumes of immigration were lower than what we're seeing today. So just keep that in mind, because I think a lot of the issues we face today is because volumes have increased dramatically. But the entrepreneur program was one in which applicants who were entrepreneurs had businesses overseas. If they met certain minimum thresholds in terms of net worth and the size of their business and sales overseas, were able to obtain permanent residency. It was a little bit complicated and difficult for IRCC to manage, because what they did was to give conditional permanent residency to applicants. And in order for that condition to be met, the applicants had to set up their business in Canada. They had to meet, again, certain thresholds in terms of investment and number of employees hired, as well as investments that or revenue generated by the business. And if they did, then that condition was waived. It's kind of a precursor to a lot of the entrepreneur programs we have at the provincial levels, because they've kind of tweaked it. They give a work permit for that sort of initial stage of coming and setting up businesses. But that entrepreneur program was running until, I want to say, 2012, 2011, something like that. We also had federal investor program. The federal investor program was, it commonly people will speak about it. If you have money, you can immigrate to Canada, but that was only a portion of it. And you did have to have a high net worth, but you also had to demonstrate that you had business experience. And that business experience had to be, you had a legitimate incorporation, business licenses, employee taxes, all of those documents were submitted. The good thing about the investor program, where we think about, high net worth individuals, was that it was a passive investor program. They had to make an investment, was a certain amount that they had to pay to the federal government. And in exchange for that investment that was being made, they were granted permanent residency. But again, as I said, in order to qualify, it wasn't just anybody who had money. It had to be that you had business experience and you could demonstrate how you generated your income. That program was again stopped around 2010, 11. And Quebec continued to have an investor program, actually continues to have an investor program. It's changed significantly in recent years. It's become much smaller. Now they want, in addition to everything that I just described, they also want French language ability, which narrows the market of potential applicants that can apply. But this is the kind of background that Canada had. And once we talk about other other entrepreneur pathways that people are talking about, everything is always being compared to the cost and the processes of those prior programs, right? So when you hear large figures, they don't just come from, a vacuum of this is what the cost of this particular service is. A lot of time people are comparing it. So this is how much the investor program used to cost. So it's reasonable that an entrepreneur will be expending similar amounts of money. So I think that's interesting. There's different reasons why those programs stopped. I think the entrepreneur program, it was just cumbersome for them to maintain that screening and ensure that they were lifting conditions for permanent residents after they'd met their requirements. And also for the investor program, there was, various kinds of articles that were saying people are buying permanent residency without a real understanding that you have to demonstrate your source of funds and the possibility that those funds could be used for, all kinds of different things, infrastructure, investing in local communities and so on. But because we don't have those programs anymore, that's the kind of world that we live in, where now we're restricted to only one federal business class application category, which is the startup visa, because we know the self-employed category was also closed off, at least for a temporary period of time. And even before that, it was very small in terms of overall numbers. And therefore, a lot of people are turning either to provincial programs, which have their own limitation, or trying to use other work permit entry pathway, and then potentially trying to find permanent residency pathways later. But this is kind of a very short summary of how we've gotten to the point that we are today.
Right. And that's kind of a great jump off point. I have a few questions based on that, Zeynab. Like, number one, do you think it was warranted to shut those down? And then number two, one of my concerns is, like, you just mentioned that there's one more PR pathway, startup visa. They just heavily capped that as well, right? Yeah. So, like, are we, or is the government, I guess, conflating, hey, we let in too many immigrants over the last 5 years, and what I think they're doing is the pendulum is swinging back way too far. Now they're kind of over adjusting. And yes, a lot of adjustments need to be made, but aren't these entrepreneurs, especially successful entrepreneurs with good track records and revenues? And, one of the key goals in government here, on the corporate side, is job creation. These are the exact people that could probably come in and create jobs. So are we headed in the right direction in that regard?
I don't think we are headed in the right direction. I think the problem is that when the entrepreneur program was shut down, they did not rethink it. I remember making submissions on this back in 2013, 2014, that we need to bring back some version of an entrepreneur program at the federal level. And, the challenges that we've had on the startup visa front in terms of much larger volumes of applications is because we don't have an entrepreneur program that's more broad. So, all you need to do is take a look at the financial papers, the Globe and so on, and to see that we are looking at a tsunami of retiring boomers in the next little bit, and their businesses need to be transferred. And, one fantastic opportunity would be to have a federal program that, the challenges that were faced in the prior program in terms of having conditional permanent residency could be resolved. There could be clear guidelines of how this can work. And I think there is certainly a need for it in terms of what Canada needs. There is huge benefits that there can be, because when we look at the data, entrepreneurs, for various reasons, immigrants end up being entrepreneurs at a far greater rate than the population that's second, third, or fourth generation in Canada, right? So there's a lot of benefit that we could have if we do have a federal entrepreneur pathway. And the startup visa was intended to be a very niche program that is intended to be for tech and extremely high growth. And that's fantastic. We need it. But we also have a lot of mom and pop shops. We have other types of businesses that need to be, taken over, that need to be even initiated, started. And that is the main street of Canada, right? So I think this is important. I don't think that enough people have pushed this. Maybe, business organizations across Canada are going to have to come back and look at this and maybe push this as part of their, lobbying with the government, because there aren't enough people raising this as a concern. And yes, we do need, skilled workers. We need other types of immigrants. But if we don't have the, highly motivated, risk-taking, entrepreneurial individuals that are also able to come to Canada and take over businesses or run businesses, we're certainly missing out.
Absolutely. I mean, not only is our economy not doing amazing now, but like you said, a huge number of entrepreneurs will be retiring or moving on or God knows what in the next few years.
Well,
do you think part of the reason why is because the feds have been okay passing that torch along to the provinces in the form of the entrepreneurial PNPs?
maybe, but you just have to look at the numbers, and the numbers are not there. There's I don't unfortunately have it right before me, but there's hundreds of thousands of small businesses that are in this position across the country. And that is nowhere near the volume of allocation for entrepreneur PNP. We look at programs like the one in Ontario was closed down. There's programs in other provinces, but the total numbers are not high. And maybe that was part of the thinking, but unfortunately, the data from the last 10 years shows us that there's just not enough allocation in that category to be able to meet that need.
For sure. So let's say tomorrow you wake up, you open up your laptop, you start your day at work, and you get a call. Minister Miller's on the line. He says, Zeynab, we heard your podcast. We subscribed to it. It's an amazing show that Josh hosts, but your episode really stuck out. We want to implement a new federal entrepreneurial immigration program. We want your help to design it. How would you design that program, or what would be kind of the key, eligibility requirements or steps?
That is a fantastic question. I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about this and talking to others about it, so I can sort of address it from different perspectives. One of the key lessons that we've learned, particularly from the startup in the last 10 years, but also from the various previous programs, is the more clear guidelines we have and, black letter law and this is the threshold you have to meet, the better the program is going to be implemented. So coming together, looking at what the threshold requirements are for the investment that has to be made in Canada, maybe at 200,000. The numbers may vary a little by province and location, but there could be a clear threshold that determined then, how many jobs have to be created. If a business already has X, maybe that has to be increased by a certain number. And, there would be some requirements in terms of making sure that these are genuine businesses, that it's not just for immigration purposes, but it's clear how we can do that. We can take the lessons from, for example, the startup visa and implement that. So that would be clear thresholds. And I think actually the provincial program is not a bad idea. The problem is a lot of times people will get nominated by province for an entrepreneur program, and they will not be granted a work permit by the federal government because there's different, decision-making that's going on. And that's a huge waste of resources. An applicant has spent potentially months getting to that point, and then, they have a business plan, have things lined up in the province, and they can't go because they don't get the work permit. But if the federal program is very clear, you go through this, we will give you a 2-year work permit, you do these things in the first 18 months, and boom, it's very clear you can qualify for permanent residency it will give people a very clear pathway. We won't have a lot of people that will come and are just waiting. They're not sure how much they're going to invest, if they're going to get the PR. And it's not just that people are doing it for immigration purposes. It's their families. Where are my kids going to go to school? Like, there's all kinds of decisions that we would want to be clear on. So why is it that we're saying others who are successful in their own countries for the most part should come here and live in limbo for 3, 4, 5 years? If we have clear guidelines, we set a threshold, we provide this period of time that they can actually come and implement the things that they say that they're going to do. And if they provide evidence that they've done it, we get their permanent residency. It has to be clear. It has to be quick. I think a 2-year timeline is perfect on this. But I mean, it can be tweaked. But I think the meat, the bones of it would be that we'd have to work on how to actually implement it. But there would be a lot of interest, and I think it would be fantastic in terms of helping people who want to sell their businesses that are already existing here. It could be a way of also doing new businesses, but I think we'd have to think a little bit more carefully about what the thresholds for those are. But it is completely possible. And I think if people have a better experience, I've heard you talk about Brand Canada, and I really like that term because unfortunately we've taken a hit. It's not reliable. And that's what, business people are looking at. Is this a reliable investment for me? Like, do I see a clear pathway? And if people don't, then they're not going to make the investments. But if they do, and they said this is reliable, if I take the step, this is what I'm going to do over the next 24 months, then I think more people are going to invest, and that's going to lead to jobs and higher investment and more innovation here in Canada.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with everything that you said. And I think one of the reasons why it could be done pretty well, like you said, the devil would probably also be in the details. But when it comes to business immigration and entrepreneurial immigration, I think like the provinces have actually done a pretty good job of at least lining up what that could look like, right?
Yeah.
The easiest way to be objective and have clear guidelines is using numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Minimum amount of investment, minimum amount of net worth requirement, minimum amount of job requirements. That can all be very easily delineated and followed and, objectively kind of, hopefully processed on the back end. So anyways, I totally agree. I think it's a very interesting time right now, as you mentioned, Brand Canada, where obviously the government is taking concerns of people inside Canada who are concerned about the influx of what the government's let in over the years versus the fact that we are going to continue to need immigration, whether people like it or not, especially skilled and entrepreneurial and stuff like that. Now, let's talk about your work with clients. How does your work with clients, specifically entrepreneurs or business clients, differ? And for those who are curious, we have plenty of episodes about, spousal sponsorship and more kind of like family class type of applications, which I highly recommend that you folks check out if you're interested. More so on the entrepreneurial and business client side, how does your mindset or how does your advice kind of shift when you're dealing with them?
In every area of immigration, you have to stay on top of developments. But I think in this particular area, there's a lot of moving parts. And what goes into a business immigration and entrepreneurial type of application, it oftentimes far more than just the legal immigration work that we would do, for example, on a express entry or a family sponsorship application, right? So when you're in a family sponsorship application, you're not acting as a family counselor. Like if they have issues, like, should I stay in this relationship? That's not the kind of questions you're going to be answering. And I think one of the tricky things in business immigration is that there is a bit of a muddied line there. And as someone who's sort of practiced in this for over a decade, I try to be very careful in understanding, one, I have to understand the client's business and what their options are and present them with with the immigration option. But that is different from giving them business advice. And I think sometimes, particularly with some practitioners, this is where they can kind of get into a little bit of trouble because maybe they're, recommending businesses for them to buy or saying this is what you should do or that's what you should do. But there's legal consequences to that kind of business advice, right? So being very clear in terms of understanding what the business is, what it can do in terms of immigration processes, does it qualify under certain things. But being very careful not to overstep and start to provide advice that could lead to other potential liability. But that's where, in a lot of these cases, we end up working, with others, with other professionals. So it might be with accountants, might be with business plan writers, and so on, where they have the expertise. So if the client is wondering, I don't know how this market really works in Canada. I'm not in a position to be able to answer that, right? But I am in a position to be able to say, well, these are some experts. These are some, accountant, business advisors, and so on. Let's bring someone on board to help with this aspect of it. So a lot of these applications require, for us, I think, as practitioners, to have an understanding generally of how businesses work, whether the concerns that drive the entrepreneurs that are contacting us, but to also know when to bring in outside assistance to help with certain aspects of these applications. And again, because of the way that we don't have a federal entrepreneur program, working through what the potential timelines and steps of a process could be in managing client expectation for them to understand, first of all, if for example, we're applying for an intercompany work permit or, a significant benefit work permit, depending what it is, that this is a work permit application, that there might be pathway, but all of those conversations about how things can change and the risks involved. And I actually think that oftentimes business owners and entrepreneurs have a good understanding of risk. They like to just know it up front so they can plan for the risk, right? So the conversations you often have is what can happen, what are the likely timelines, but then, thinking about plan Bs and what to look at in terms of if these things don't work out. So it very much spending a lot of time on understanding the client, a lot of strategy up front, and then, hoping for the best as we go through that things don't change as they recently did with massive big changes that came up in ICT work permit.
Yeah, there's been no shortage of changes. And for those who are interested in some of the ICT work permit changes, I definitely recommend checking out the previous episode 26 with Noman, where I had a good chat about that. I want to talk about another very big change. It isn't as recent, but I'm still very curious about it, especially because number one, Zeynab, you have a lot of experience with the program. And number two, just with the general lens of, hey, if I'm an entrepreneur and I'm thinking about Canada, what are some of my options? Startup visa, still an option, right? Quote unquote, for those who are listening, I'm doing the bunny ears. But earlier this year, huge cap restriction put on the program. Can you talk a little bit about, I think we all know, maybe you can start really quickly with like why it happened. Those of us in the immigration space, I think, know. So maybe you can just kind of keep that more 30,000 foot view. And then what I'm especially curious about is like, what is the state of the program right now? Is it still popular? Is it worth even applying for? Like, what are your thoughts there?
Well, so going back to this program was intended to be for highly innovative, potentially high growth, literally startups. So what we think of as a startup when we say that term in a social context, right? And because we haven't had the investor program or entrepreneur program otherwise, a lot of people have started to look at this category as an option for applying for immigration. And as a result, we've had huge oversubscription. And there was no regulation at all in terms of numbers for, since the program was started, because it was envisioned that it was going to be very small. And to be honest, in the early years, it was like I actually had clients in 2016, 2017, where they got their PR in a number of just months. Like I had two co-founders from India and their PR applications were approved in 2 months. And it was fantastic. That's what it was. And it's interesting because they're here and I actually, not that I mention names, but I follow this person on LinkedIn and she's constantly like a leader in this space. And this is exactly what the program was intended to be. But because of all of these other issues, we've had a lot more volume of applications be submitted for this. This has led to much longer processing, all kinds of other issues that have arisen. And, instead of taking a more subtle approach, IRCC finally came down with a bit of a sledgehammer on 30th of April. They actually announced it on the 29th and said, as of the next day, designated entities would only be able to issue 10 letters of support per year. So 10 teams total. And so 10 commitment certificates. So technically they could support up to 50 founders because each startup could have up to 5 co-founders. And it's interesting because there were some designated, you look at their data, they don't really support more than a couple of people per year anyway. And then there were some that were supporting a lot of applicants per year. And the drastic changes that came on just literally overnight have had, I think, big consequences. And I can think about it in different ways. One, I work a lot in the tech space anyway. That's how I've gone into the startup visa. Like most of the time people had a letter of support when they came to me and I was just helping them with the immigration. So that's how I have expertise on the legal and immigration side of this. Again, going back to what I said earlier, I'm not a business consultant. I'm not an expert on the business side of things. I worked with founders that had barely enough money to show their minimum funds requirements. They were young. They had fantastic ideas, but you just graduated from university, had minimum savings that they were scraping everything just to get to the minimum, LICO amount that you have to show. And we've gone from that kind of situation to where there's a lot of high net worth applicants. And, again, I'm saying we don't have other pathways, and it is possible you could be high net worth and you have a fantastic idea and you want to go through this program. But at the end of the day, what's going to happen is, and what had happened is I'm sort of seeing this here and there. It's very difficult to get specific data on it unless you are designated into yourself. But the price, essentially, of being able to get a letter support has gone up drastically. And that is pricing out those fantastic, amazing founders that don't have those funds. So what's that going to do for Canada? I think, unfortunately, unless there's, there are still a couple of fantastic incubators that we have in Canada that are part of this, and they would support like 2 or 3 startups per year, they're going to continue, but it can be extremely difficult to get into those. I think people in that cohort of high growth tech company will start to look elsewhere. They're already looking at Europe. They're looking at the US. It's the thing that we're going to miss out. But I think at the end of the day, we'll still get, there's about 80 entities. So I think IRCC will get its full 750 to 800 applications per year. I think the letters of support will be maxed out. But in terms of what the goal of the program was, to try and attract these folks who may come in and have a fantastic first startup, or that will go on to be serial entrepreneurs and will have eventually a really successful startup, I'm not sure we'll be able to capture that anymore. And that's a shame. And then as a result of that, I'm not sure what the future of the program is going to be, right? The processing times are still very long. We're looking at 2 to 4 years. And we're also seeing in the, the weeds of it, which is where I'm at, a lot of people are contacting me where they're facing concerns after 2 or 3 years where IRCC's finally opened their application and they're telling them, oh, you don't meet X, Y, and Z. And the problem is there's not clear guidelines on the part of IRCC, and people are facing, challenges there. And so I think reputationally, the program is just not going to be as much of a pull going forward. We'll have to see. I mean, I'll be curious to see what the data is, a year after in October 2025. But my prediction is it's not going to be good.
Yeah, and like you said, I echo the sentiment of it being extremely concerning. It is an interesting time right now, and I understand that a lot of people are upset with the way the government has treated immigration for years and years, which I agree with the frustration. But my big concern is that people, especially if they're not in the industry like we are, conflating, hey, the government let in too many people, therefore all immigration is bad. And I think it's a terrible outlook. And that's part of why we like to have conversations like these with experts like you, because we, as we said earlier, we need more entrepreneurs. But now because of these overcorrections, we're not going to attract as many of the best and brightest anymore. And I think that's a huge shame. Now, my biggest concern, Zeynab,
I was going to say, if you think about it, the, overall number of entrepreneurs that, is on the plan is about 480 to 500 crowds, and let's just put it there. The total number of business immigrants under the startup and the self-employed, which is now actually closed, it's less than 10,000. Like, it's a drop in the bucket, what we're talking about. But it's a contingent that can have a huge impact if they are allowed to, have pathways to permanent residency and have that security to be able to make bigger investments in Canada. So it's really, really important to get that nuanced message out there that maybe we do have too many students. And that's a conversation that we need to address. But at the same time, we do not have an overload of entrepreneurs, right? So just want to add that.
Well, we've seen reports this year that entrepreneurship in Canada is way down over the last 20 years. The other way I like to think about it, and I love that kind of reframe that you used, is I don't have the statistic, but every year there's only so many, let's just say tech founders. We could say entrepreneurs in general, but let's just, we're on the topic. There's only so many really impressive, successful tech founders every year that wake up and say, you know what, I want to expand to another country.
Yeah.
Probably not a huge amount. And if Brand Canada takes such a big hit and these programs become so onerous and difficult, those best and brightest are going to go elsewhere, right? So whereas we could have attracted these amazing founders and companies and job creators and taxpayers, they're just going somewhere else, right? Whether we like or don't like immigration, quote unquote. So that's a big concern. Another big concern of mine, Zeynab, and a theme I'm kind of picking up on, and this is one of the reasons why I love hosting the podcast, is I get a lot of conversations with smart people, and over time themes kind of emerge. And one of them is, I actually think IRCC does a great job of creating programs, but they've done, especially over the last 8 years, and you probably know where I'm going with this, they do a terrible job of regulating and the implementation on the back end. As you alluded to earlier, Startup Visa used to be a great program. I think, Express Entry used to be an amazing, it was a world-renowned PR program. Our study permit process, used to be world-renowned. Now, all of those have become very difficult and almost a bit of a joke and very difficult because they did no regulation. They all kind of scaled, especially SUV and especially international students, kind of got out of control in sub-industries and a lot of fraud and people taking advantage of it. And so they do nothing for 8 years and then just cut the knees out from under them. So what do you how can we avoid that? What's the solution here? And what approach would you like to see from government regarding these entrepreneurial and business programs so that we can, not turn those business owners away?
Yeah, that is such a good question, Josh, because, for example, the startup program, when it came out, it was a 5-year pilot. And the first 5 years went very well. And I think the first 5 years ended because it started in 2013, so 2018, 5 years later, it became a permanent program. And if you just looked at the data, you would have said, oh, this looks great. We've had a little bit of growth. It's come to about a couple of hundred applications per year. This is kind of where we want to be. But if you had talked at that point to stakeholders and you monitored how the program was being marketed overseas and to applicants, you would have seen the writing on the wall in 2018. You would have seen this has been a mushroom. I do a lot of CPDs, and I remember, I think it was in late 2018, I did the CPD. They were very insistent, please do a CPD on the startup visa. And I did, and I said, this is something you want to be very mindful of, because these are the various types of issues that are going to come up. And to this day, all of those issues that I've predicted have come up. Processing times have gone up. If people were in groups, if they did not fully understand that if there's an essential person, non-essential person, if people change their mind, this is going to impact things. All of that stuff was predictable from somebody who was in the industry working on it. I think it's unfortunate that there's not more of a dialogue between industry practitioners and IRCC in terms of being able to understand where these patterns are going, right? We made submissions even back in, I told you before 2018, that we need to have other business pathways. Otherwise, people are going to flock to that. So I actually, personally, I think visa officers, which are the implementation frontline workers, are always stuck in a very difficult position. It's never their fault when they're dealing with high volumes. And then as a result, we get, insane refusals on startups, and we get weird things happening on the study permit. I'm not even going to go into that right now. But I think what needs to happen is there has to be regular checking and not just looking at your past data, but talking to people who are in the market looking at future, right? So if we were, again, on the study permits, if we were mindful of how the study permits were being marketed overseas, the numbers could have been cut much earlier. We could have come up with clearer guidelines. And I think another part of this is we come up with these amazing programs, but we just don't have enough, details and guidelines and those, minimum requirements and so on. And so people go in and think, for the longest time, the startup visa was always like, this is the easiest thing. You don't need a degree. You need a very minimum English. And if you've had some entrepreneurial background, and I was always like, this is not what this program is. But if you market it as that and you get people who apply, you're going to end up in the kind of situation that we're in today, where you have large volumes and officers are frustrated. People are thinking that we're not getting the results that we want from the program. So I think consultations with stakeholders and also having much clearer guidelines. We can make things more difficult. That's fine. But just make it clear that this is what the requirement is, and people will be able to act accordingly, and it will be a fairer process. And honestly, we'll get better outcomes.
Yeah, that seems to be like a win-win-win, right? If the client has a better idea, or the aspiring immigrant has a better idea, they can maybe figure out a little bit more on their own, so they're less reliant on, scammy players abroad trying to, sell stuff that they shouldn't be. The lawyers and consultants can better prepare applications, and then IRCC will have an easier time processing because they know what to look for. There's a clearer checklist. So I think that's a great suggestion. I think that the open communication, 100%. Unfortunately, it looks like IRCC is going in the opposite direction, right? You read their website, and what it seems is that more and more they're pushing aspiring immigrants towards the fact that they don't need representation, which is a little bit of a shame. Like you said, I did an earlier episode with Earl Blaney. He's a consultant who's done a lot of work in the international student space. He's been posting about this study permit issue that's only come to light in the last year. He's been posting about it for 4 years, right? Just like, so along the lines of what you said, you've seen the writing on the wall for 6 years now. We have experts, professionals like you who do this day in and day out. You can see it years in advance. And for some reason, that line of communication is not being leveraged, which is extremely sad. Do you think, what's the solution to that, Zeynab? Is it like organizations like, I know you're a member of CELA, you're a member of the CBA, should it be done through that and they already do try to have open communication? How much of it is it on us, the professionals, to try and move that conversation forward? How much of it is on the government, or is the government even open to having those conversations right now? I hate to say.
I think they are open generally to having these conversations. And I think, the advocacy work that we do with these organizations does have an impact. The challenge is the government is a huge machine, right? There's so many different levels that they have to go through. We work on the private side. We're very agile. We're able to make decisions quickly. We're pivoting. We're doing different things. That's unfortunately not how government works. And, and CELA does this, but I've been watching, for example, CBA meets with IRCC on a regular basis. And it's little incremental change that they're able to bring, but bigger issues like policy issues, I think they just need to, and this is not just with IRCC, I'm sure it's with other aspects of government too, the mechanism for decision making, there's just so many different layers to it, right? Even when fantastic feedback is provided or there's really great suggestions on the table, getting that to the point of changing things in terms of policy is extremely difficult to do. I think that's what we have to still aspire to. I think we need to have these conversations. I think we need to be involved in our various organizations in terms of written advocacy, trying to, go before Senate and citizenship or immigration hearings in Ottawa. Those things are important and they do help move the needle And at the end of the day, the more of this information that we put out there and try to raise awareness, hopefully this becomes a bit of an issue that when they are making decisions on what to change, they'll take it into consideration. But it's something that I think all governments struggle with at the end of the day, that, they're always behind in terms of what needs to be done, right? Unfortunately, the result of this has been, almost once in a lifetime kind of change in sentiment towards immigration. I don't remember, and I am definitely older than you, Josh, but I'm not that old. But I still don't remember a time in Canada where we had a negative overall discussion about immigration. I think this is the first time. And it's pretty bad that we got to this point. And I still don't think it's a very accurate conversation either, but we still need to keep pushing against that and, sharing our experiences so that people understand what is actually going on the ground.
Absolutely. And again, just a win-win. If the conversations between the immigration bar and the immigration experts and IRCC, right? I mean, there's what is there to lose by sharing more information and stuff like that? Zeynab, my last question before we kind of wrap up and I ask for, where people can find you and all that good stuff is, we've talked about PR for entrepreneurs, startup visa. We talked about the former federal programs. We touched on PNPs. Can you very quickly summarize, like if someone's interested in coming to Canada today, again, it's October 2024. If you're listening to this a month from now, who knows how much could have changed by then. But anyways, if someone comes to you today and says, listen, I can't do startup visa, I can't do PNPs, what would you say, or are there any good work permit opportunities that you would suggest right now?
There might be opportunities to apply under the intercompany transferee if they already have an existing successful business, or, significant benefit if they have, a business that's going to have a significant impact in Canada. And that is very subjective. You mentioned Naman's session, he talks a lot about the changes that came in on the ICT. And it is, and I said this, I think it didn't come up in our conversation, but I think it's important, the practitioners in this area work with folks from different parts of the world. And the options that people have are very different based on if their country is visa requiring or if it has certain trade agreements with Canada. So some of these changes that have come into play with the intercompany transferee will apply to certain applicants, but they won't necessarily apply to us. So for example, US and Mexico will not be impacted because of the definition that there is in terms of multinational. Multinational is really not a definition that's found under the CUFMA, Canada, US. Yes, that's it.
CUSMA.
There we go. And then, but what is happening, I mean, this is just very new, is that, those strategy discussions we have are becoming even more complicated. So if we do have somebody who we were discussing the potential of an intercompany transfer application with, now we might have to do an additional step, right? They're not a multinational in terms of having operations in another country. What are ways in which we can demonstrate that they can get there? Either having to set up another operation elsewhere, fully develop their Canadian operations before we do any application. So those conversations are becoming even more complicated, unfortunately. But those are sort of the two big ones that we are currently sort of using for a lot of our entrepreneur applicants.
Got it. Zeynab, this has been a great episode. I really, number one, learned a lot. And number two, I think this episode paired with the previous one creates an amazing, almost tutorial on entrepreneurship in Canadian immigration. So I really appreciate it. If folks are out there and they want to learn more about you, or maybe they want to get in touch or potentially use your services, where do you recommend that they go?
I'm a little active on LinkedIn, so I do post there a little bit. So you can always connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm a big proponent of sharing as much information as I can. They can also contact me at my law firm, Visa Law Group. My website is myvisa.law. But yeah, I'm very glad that you asked me to come and talk about this, because this is a topic that is dear to my heart. I've been practicing in this space for a long time, and I'm glad that I had the opportunity to talk about it.
Awesome, Zeynab. We definitely benefited from it. Thank you again for coming on the show. We will have links to Zeynab's LinkedIn and law firm website in the description, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on your favorite podcast platform. Zeynab, thank you again for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Josh.